Hello, my name is Yesika Salgado, and I am a Salvadoran, LA-born poet who writes about her family, about her culture, about her city, and her fat brown body. And I'm so happy to be here with you today. Thank you for having me, Boulder Bookstore. Thank you for creating programming around Fat Liberation Month. And I only wish I had known of things like this sooner, but I'm so happy to be here. I'm fat. And I'm a writer and I'm a poet and I think my fatness has been my superpower when it comes to writing. There's a lot of things that I experienced as a young fat woman of color and then growing up and moving through the world in a body that is often spoken of, criticized, critiqued, shamed, but never really seen. And because I didn't feel seen, I always turned to the page. The page has room for everybody. The page will always listen, and the page never criticizes. Although I do think that a blank page feels very criticizing when you're staring at it and you can't get anything written. But that's for another conversation at another time and another day. So I have a few questions I'm going to answer for you, and I'm so grateful. Again, I just want to say again, thank you, Boulder Bookstore, for having me. So, can a brief overview of my poetry collection? The collection that we're speaking of today is Hermosa. I've written three books, Corazón, Tesoro, and Hermosa. Hermosa is my most recent book, my newest book. I'm sorry for all the extra noises. My neighborhood is a little loud. This is the second time I try to record this video, so we're just gonna roll with whatever happens. So Hermosa is my third collection, and I wrote Corazón with the intentions of it being a love story that allowed people to see themselves in it. It talks about the yearning for love, searching love, finding it, experiencing it, having it go really sour, losing it, and surviving it, and finding love everywhere in your life. Tesoro was more of a look at what machismo has done to my family and the women in my culture and my country, El Salvador, and how that has influenced the woman that I've become in the world and the things that I've had to overcome, right? And then also always the question of like, why do we forgive men for the things that we don't forgive the women for? And so when it came time to write Hermosa, I had done a lot of emotional work in the other two books. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to write. And my friend Gabby Rivera, who is a beautiful, amazing writer, also a chubby babe, as she refers to herself, um, was in town for some work thing, and we met up for lunch. We were eating pupusas in here in LA in Eagle Rock, and at some point she's like, "What about your book?" And I'm like, "I'm stuck." And she cleared the place and said, "I'm here to work, so let's work. Let's talk about this book. Why are you stuck?" And so I start crying. I'm a Cancer. I cry all the time. So I start crying and explaining to her about how like I don't know, like I feel lost, I feel stuck, da 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 da, whatever. And she goes, "Jessica, I love your other books, but as a fan of your work and as your friend, I've yet to see this Yesika. The fabulous nails, makeup, hoops, the bad bitch Yesika. Sorry, I don't know if I could cuss, but it'll be the only time I throw it in there. I haven't seen her show up in books. And so then that like lit a fire on like wherever it is that the poems come from. And I went home and I knew exactly what to do. I had written a lot of the poems already. I had a residency in New York for a period of time at Troutbeck Hotel, and I was in the snow. And at the time, I had a column named Suelta, and I had written what I didn't know was like a third of the poems that ended up becoming Hermosa, which Hermosa is mostly a love letter to myself, to Los Angeles, and to all the brown girls of LA and our experience. I talk a lot about taking public transportation throughout the book. I talk a lot about being a fat woman that's empowered by her sexuality, how I'm not going to be ashamed of the fact that I like having sex. Who doesn't? Right? But as sometimes larger bodies, we don't get to choose when we're objectified. We're either a fetish that's secret and taboo, or we're supposed to kind of be these beings that don't have a gender and is not because we feel that way, right? We get stripped of any sexuality or we get overly sexualized. There tends to be no power for that for us. And so Hermosa is just me celebrating the woman that I had to fight to become, all the things I had to go through. And the name Hermosa comes from, and I'm a little long-winded and I haven't even moved on to the next questions. But still, the name Hermosa comes from, I tell people that all the names of my books are things my father called me out of affection, and that's true. But Hermosa is really named Hermosa after some woman in El Salvador, the elder woman in our village. I remember one of the first times I went back. Well, I think I was already a little older. I went back every summer from when I was 12 till I was 18. And I was already like, I think it was the year that I was 17. And I've always been fat. I've always been la gordita, right? And so I was in our hometown, in our home village, and I remember there was a group of women that were like, "Oh, tú eres la hija de Adela," right? They don't know my name. They just know who I belong to. I'm Adela's daughter. And they're like, "Qué hermosa, qué hermosura de mujer." And they were like touching on me and like just grabbing my meat. And it wasn't in a critical way. It wasn't shaming me. It was, they were marveling over the abundance of my body because they saw that the abundance that I have was a sign of my parents' success. And, and oh, sure, there's some stuff layered in that that probably needs to be processed or whatever. But I just know that that was one of the first times that I felt like a goddess, right? I felt empowered. I felt like I was more than just pretty, or I was more than a fat girl with a pretty face, right? It was always something said with lastima, like, "Oh, you have such a pretty face," but mm. And these women were like, "No, your bigness, your fatness is such a gift. What I would give to have it." And so, Hermosa, I carried that name with me for years. I didn't write Hermosa until I was like 35 I don't even know how old I was. 35 until I was 35, but I carried that with me for years because I knew that that name, that word was going to be something, was I was going to give it to something. It was going to end up somewhere. And so it was my third book and the book that we're talking about today. The next question is, I gave you a brief overview of my poetry collection. What inspires my poetry? Everything. And I know that sounds so vague to say that everything inspires my poetry, but it does. I'm very inspired by how love lives everywhere. And I don't only speak of romantic love. I mean, that's easy to write about, right? Like romance. I write about that a lot. I grew up on novelas and love songs, okay? Los Bukis, Juan Gabriel, María Mercedes, Mariela del Barrio, those all raised me. And like my mom's black and white movies with Pedro Infante crooning at a woman, all that love, all of that melancholia, all of that ache, right, shows up in my work and informs a lot of my work, but none of that would exist without love. But I also, my poems about my homegirls, my poems about LA, my poems about El Salvador, my poems about um San Antonio, like cities I visited and fallen in love with because of the love the city gave me when I was there. Every poem is a love poem, whether it's the presence of love or the absence of love. And the more self-love I've discovered, I mean, we're constantly on a journey of loving ourselves and accepting ourselves at every stage in our life, right? But the deeper I go into myself, the more I have to give, the more I have to speak about, the more I'm willing to see love everywhere. And that's always informing what I write about, always. Like, I was at a coffee shop on Friday, just 2 days ago. Today is Sunday. I'm pre-recording this for you. But I was at a coffee shop and there was uh two women at a table and I was observing them and I couldn't tell if they were a couple, if they were homegirls, if they were sisters. They were very close and there was just this affection and giggling, a lot of affection and giggling happening. And I love seeing that. I love that. I love seeing people giggle and just be innocent and be carefree, right? And and they were sharing a piece of pastry, and one of the women is like eating it, picking off bits and eating it. And then at some point, she puts another piece in the other woman's mouth. And then the other woman wasn't expecting it. So she starts laughing and it like falls off her face. And then after that, I decided I need to leave them alone. And I put on my headphones and got back to work that I was doing at the coffee shop. But I remember just like, I had to stop what I was working on to write about feeding somebody you love and how many versions of that exist in my life, right? Like a lover feeding me some mangoes on a couch. I have a poem about that, but I also have a poem about my mom coming and being like, taste this. I made this for you. And so little moments of love will always influence everything I write. So that's the answer to what inspires my writing. And then also like my poetry. Um, yeah, love inspires so much. There's so much abundance in it. My writing process. What is my writing process? How does that happen? Well, it's changed throughout the years. When I was younger and a teenager, I always writing, journaling. I journaled every night. I would write until I would go to sleep. Sometimes I would write throughout the whole night and fall asleep in the morning. I would write like I was on fire. But then I got older and more things came into my life and I had a lot of stuff happening. And then it was writing whenever I had free time. When I worked as a cashier in a parking garage, and I would write poems on my phone. And if I got in trouble for having my poems out, I would write poems on the receipts. I would print out, like, I would pull out empty receipt papers and just write on that. I was constantly reading and constantly writing. And then, then I started doing poetry full time. And when I began doing poetry full time, writing full time, it became a little bit harder. But whenever I'm working on a project like a book, I have to remove myself from my friends, from my environment. I find a coffee shop I could get lost in. I have to feel like I could get lost in a coffee shop. I can't feel like I'm being watched, right? But a coffee shop I can get lost in and write and work there. And I have to be able to be there for hours and I can't be bothered. I'm not writing the whole time I'm there, but if I'm telling myself I'm working right now, I'm writing right now, I'm more likely to write than not. And I realized that I need isolation to create now. Before I used to be able to create in the chaos, and that's not true anymore. And it changes. I've been reading A House of My Own by Sandra Cisneros, and Sandra has spoken pretty often about like how a writer has to go into solitude to write. And I was like, I don't. I could write in the middle of my whole family. Like I've written poems on the couch when there's like Thanksgiving dinner happening around me. But that was when I was on fire. That was when I needed so badly to be heard. I had so much to say. Now there's not so much of that. So now it has to be done with some respect to the craft, right? Some because I know now the work you get a little bit more, you slow down a little bit more the older you get as a writer. And I used to think of that as a bad thing, but I don't think that's true anymore. I think now you understand that when things get published, when you write to share with an audience, you want it to get the closest to close that it can get. And it's okay to take your time with that. And so now that's what I do. Sometimes I need to get a little staycation. I get a hotel room somewhere and I lock myself in that hotel for 5 days. I only come out to eat or to take a walk or to not feel like I've vanished completely. And then I go back and I keep working and I keep sometimes no writing gets done and I just need to be in solitude. And then when I come back home, I'm down to write and it all happens. I've just learned that now it just takes work to find the inspiration, work to find the creativity and allow it to happen. Maybe I'll start writing like I'm on fire again in the future, but I've learned that your craft changes as you go and you just got to be willing to show up to it. And it doesn't say anything about who you are as a writer. It doesn't mean I used to think that I was better than other people because I was a prolific writer, because I was always writing. And then I go back and I read a lot of the stuff that I was always writing. I'm like, girl, you were writing the same poem every day. But that's how we learn and that's how we grow. And then now Now I'm slower, but more intentional. That's what I was trying to get to. Um, why is Fat Liberation Month important to me? I mean, I'm fat and I've dedicated a lot of my work, my online presence. So aside from being a poet and a writer, I also have a very active Instagram that I've been very fortunate to have a moderate following on. And it's always been focused on the fact that like fat bodies deserve to be seen and celebrated just as much as any other body. And that also fat bodies get overly sexualized, get shamed. And I push back on that by either showing screenshots from dating sites um to normalize it to other women, not to make the men feel comfortable that are sending you these harassments, but for the people receiving them, for them to know that it's not something they're doing, it's not something wrong with them, that this is something that happens all the time because people have been taught that our bodies are something taboo, something that could only be desired in darkness. And I think things like Fat Liberation Month normalize conversations around fat bodies. Also, not only that, but they also give us the tools to be able to push back, to be able to challenge things, right? You hear somebody that's been doing the work of fat liberation for a long time, and they finally give words to something you've been feeling in your heart for your whole life. Sometimes you've been feeling that something was off, or you've been feeling that you're the only one that's experiencing this. And then important conversations happen that let you know that it's not you, that it's a systemic issue, and that you are only receiving, and that you're receiving all the whack parts of it, right? And so Fat Liberation Month is really important to celebrate these beautiful fat bodies, these beautiful fat folks that are creating things all around the world that are just as worthy as being seen as people that live in smaller bodies than we do. What's one thing I wish for my readers to know about NAFA and the fat right movement? And I think that's what I just talked about. I think it's important to talk about the fat rights movement. Fat rights movement isn't only about seeing a fat person and being like, they're beautiful. Like, that's beautiful. That's beautiful for us to be able to see as people, but there's also so many rights, so many things that we need. I have been on the receiving end of poor medical practices time and time again because things get written off and my fatness gets blamed for it, where it has nothing to do with my fatness. You could go into um hospital and say that your elbow's hurting because you slammed it against a wall, and they'll tell you that if you lose X amount of pounds, that your elbow will feel better. And I think that is really important to have folks advocating for fat folks in medical field, like everywhere. We're people, and we deserve to have the same rights, the same visibility that everybody else does. And I know I'm hate that I'm reading these questions off of a screen for you, but this is how we're going to make it work. I love you, and I wish we were all in person in one big room. Ugh, but Boulder Bookstore, I'm gonna come to you sooner or later, maybe during the next book tour. Um, and is there anything else that I want you to know about my book? I just want you to know that it's for you. And if you pick it up and you don't see yourself reflected in it, that is totally fine. There are so many other fat writers out there that are writing so much more beautiful work. So I can always point you to some. Right now, my brain is fried and I can't think of many names off the top of my head. But I mentioned Gabby Rivera earlier. Gabby is amazing. And look her up, please. And I'm going to share a poem with you from Hermosa. And again, thank you so much for having me for such a special occasion. Okay, I'm gonna read a poem from Hermosa, and then I'm gonna share a poem with you from Corazon. So this is Diaspora Writes to Her New Home, and it is the first poem in Hermosa. I am what comes after the Civil War. After the dismembered corpses, the burnt sugarcane fields, the mango tree strung with a single hanging body, the man with his tongue in his pocket, the soldiers and the guerrilla, the exodus of my grandmother's children. I arrived after the fleeing. After the bruise was named a desert, after the new country extended its concrete arms with reproach, after living in garages, huddling in small apartments, after raising blonde children who do not know our language, after washing cars we do not drive, after keeping home for women with alabaster skin, after falling in love in the time of asylum, after the alcohol took to my father's veins, after the family murmured his sins, after my mother cut the long coil of her curls, I found my way here and I stayed. A fist of a girl with eyes as big as a wailing mouth. I was born with a pen under my tongue. I know and own all words ever spoken. I am the dream and the nightmare. I am the burning bush, Moses, David, Goliath, Mary Magdalene, the Holy Virgin, God Himself, dead and resurrected. I am not the survival. I came after. I am the victory, a boastful flag. I am not a promise. I am a threat. I am what takes and does not give back. A new history, a forked tongue, a priestess, church and communion, a woman with her own story, a woman with her own legacy. Take this, my words, eat them, and remember me. Thank you so much. I was going to share another poem with you, but I'm going to leave it here. I am so honored to be a part of this. Thank you so much again for having me. Boulder Bookstore Fat Liberation Month is, yeah, I said everything. Get out of here. I love you. Bye.